Welcome everyone to another episode of Two Geeks and a Marketing Podcast. As always, we're here for more news, tech, content and wisdom from the world of marketing. And my co-host is a digital marketing veteran. He's a speaker, trainer and advisor with nearly 3 decades of experience who enjoys revealing visual storytelling techniques to help you build online campaigns faster. Please welcome Monsieur Pascal Fintoni.
Oh, thank you very much. You've just heard from my co-host, a marketing speaker and consultant who spent his whole career helping his customers get their marketing simple but effective. He's the author of 𝗧𝗵𝗲 Marketing Plans and the creator of the Roger video series. I give you Mr. Roger Edwards.
Oh, Pascal, thank you so much. And this is episode 117, and we do have a packed show for you today. Pascal, you describe the show as a marketing magazine, don't you? And it really is that. We've got all sorts of sections to the show. We've got the news section, which is coming up, 8 items of news that are top of mind at the moment. We're going to see the return of Mark Ritson in Content Spotlights, one of my favorite marketing authors, and you're going to be talking about how Odeon revamped its search strategy. We've got This Week in History, and we'll be talking about some fabulous things that happened back in the past which have influenced us now in the present. And of course, marketing tech and apps. I think you might be talking about Zoom today, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of investigation into some of the more recent travel apps, which is almost like a irregular series for me. But then we'll get to what is always one of the highlights of the show, and that is film marketing. And Pascal, it's your choice this week, so give us a teaser as to what we're going to be talking about later.
I will be celebrating the 20th anniversary, one of the most successful disaster movie. So 2004, we're talking about the day after tomorrow. We'll be looking at the marketing campaign, but also really 10 years on from the birth of the internet. We'll be looking at their website, thanks to Wayback Machine. And we'll be looking about PR. There's been some negative PR that became actually positive for the movie, would you believe?
Yeah, and all that snow. I feel like I can empathize with that film because the weather's been so bad here in Scotland this year, and we're in May and we still don't feel as if we've seen the sun yet this year. So I can really relate to all that snow. But we've got a lot of work to do before we get to film marketing, Pascal. So shall we kick things off and head straight into the news section of the show?
And we begin with some stats from Kantar. Nearly 30% of supermarket sales made in the 4 weeks to 14 April were made under promotion. This is the highest level since June 2021.
Advertising has an average short-term profit ROI of £1.87 per pound invested, which increases to £4.11 when sustained effects up to 24 months are included, according to a study by ThinkBox.
Okay, well, Confused.com has appointed Jeff Bull as CMO to steer the brand through a new era and deliver improved customer experience. He joins the comparison business after almost 4 years as CMO of furniture company Swift.
Brands should stop framing advertising as an investment, according to Nationwide's Director of Brand Marketing and Corporate Affairs. The word investment is problematic when discussing advertising in the boardroom. He says it's just a running cost.
All right, but Coca-Cola has unveiled Coke Sounds Z, an instrument that plays the uplifting sounds of its zero sugar soda using AI. Consumers in the US and Europe can access a digital app that turns the drink sounds into music.
Mars has launched a campaign encouraging flyers to pack its Snickers product on their next flight. The Hungry Skies campaign takes a playful approach to the stresses of flying and how the chocolate bar can make any difficult flight a bit easier.
Heineken has teamed up with streetwear retailer Bodega to launch the Boring Phone, a limited edition dumb phone with no internet access to encourage consumers to reduce screen time while supporting human connection.
And Adidas pledges to overinvest in marketing as the CEO admits we are not as good as we should be. As part of the drive, Adidas launched its Originals campaign last September, followed by the You Got This campaign at the Super Bowl, and it replaces the Impossible is Nothing tagline. Well, Pascal, I want to talk to you about the Boring Phone. And actually, there was one extra little bit on that news item, which I did think was interesting, is that there's also an app that they've developed, as well as the actual physical plastic thing you can get. And the app turns everything off on your smartphone other than voices and texts. So it basically turns your smartphone into an old style phone. Now, I have been hearing that there are certain youngsters now who are almost going without their phones, which I find remarkable. But is this just a gimmick, or is this genuinely, we've got to the stage where some people just think the phones are too intrusive, and Heineken have jumped on this to almost let's get back to talking to each other face to face?
It's not a gimmick at all. I mean, you know, you and I in the UK, as well as the rest of the world, we now have, you know, available to us all the research from medical bodies and more about the negative impact of too much time on the internet, which is what this is all about, and not enough time, you know, with meaningful human connection. And I am really heartened to hear that you're bit about the younger generation, because it's becoming tricky. You know, schools now have to take quite drastic measures and cutting signals completely, so you can't even get a 4G or the 5G, because they've done some tests. You know, if you don't use your phone as an internet access for 2 weeks, your well-being and just your ability to just get on with the day is vastly, vastly improved. And I like about Heineken, they've always done that very well. You know, they link themselves to gaming, they themselves to watching movies and so on, but they do it in such a responsible way. I think that's great.
Yeah, no, I think it's a nifty little idea, cashing in on a trend. I also thought that the Mars Hungry Skies thing is quite interesting, sort of playing a playful approach to the stresses of flying. Well, I'm just sitting here thinking they could be onto something here, because let's face it, you're going to need to have a Mars bar when you get to the airport and park in the long stay car park, and then wait 20 minutes for the bus to take you into the airport. You're then going to need a Mars bar to eat whilst you're waiting in the security queue for 25 to 30 minutes. Then you're going to have another Mars bar when the security line picks your bag out for the extra search, and then you have to wait half an hour for that. Then you're going to have another Mars bar as you walk 20 miles through the shops to get to your gate. And then finally, you're going to have another Mars bar as you get on the plane, and the pilot tells you that they've just picked up an air traffic control delay, and you won't be pushing back for another 2 hours. And that's before you've even left the tarmac.
What is interesting is Mars, obviously. I remember vividly, it was actually a feature in one of our This Week in History. The very first Mars TV advert was around this idea of, you've had a hard day's at work, now relax and bite into that, you know, lovely chocolate bar. But I would agree. I mean, when I read and when I heard you say that, I don't find flying stressful. I find the whole airport bit stressful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so let's see what they do with that.
I actually agree. I think it's the airport that is the most stressful part of the flying experience, and that's one of the reasons why I tend to try to avoid it these days. I'm surprised that Mars didn't say, we've actually introduced a colossal extra supersized Mars bar for anybody who flies regularly with Ryanair, but that's probably taking brand association a little bit too far. Interesting that Jeff Bull is now the new CMO of Confused.com, and interesting enough that he's come across to a comparison service from a furniture company, which is a bit of a jump. But when I actually read this article and I was putting it in the news, I actually just had to check what Confused.com was, because I actually didn't know what it was actually about, because it doesn't really say, does it? Confused.com. It is actually a comparison service for things like house insurance and motor insurance and that sort of thing. But Confused.com doesn't really give away what it is, does it?
I think there's that, but I was also kind of frowning, because I'm always nervous about when journalists, you know, just pick bits from the press release and the headlines, because I always feel, you know, when you talk about the new era, you talk about improved customer experience, and, you know, you read out as well what happened with Nationwide, talking, you know, about investment and so on. I'm very, very nervous because, you know, my statement, which I've shared on this show before, it took forever for marketers to have a seat at the boardroom table. And I'm always very nervous about the other board members thinking, here we go again. If a marketer just rocks up, talks about a new era and improved customer experience, as if what was done in the past wasn't good enough. So, you know, I know that this is journalists writing bits and, you know, and taking extra from the press release, but you've got to be so careful about the language that you use as a marketer, because you cannot lose your authority and your place at the boardroom table.
And talking about the language that we use as marketers, Pascal, what do you make of this assertion by Nationwide's director that we shouldn't be calling marketing an investment, and we should just be calling it what he thinks it is, and that's a running cost. Now, just as a bit of background, I think it's one of the lessons that we have been taught as marketers. Make sure that the people are sitting at the board table see marketing as an investment in new business, an investment in sales, an investment in acquiring customers. But this guy is actually saying the opposite. No, it's just a running cost. And I can see arguments both ways. You know, if it's a running cost, then you can almost say, well, we can never be without it. Whereas if it's an investment and you're having a lean year, you might say, well, we're going to have to cut investment a bit. What do you think?
Well, what's interesting is I can't agree with that statement, but that's what, you know, this occupation is fascinating, because actually, if you go back to the very first news item you read, we talk about short-term ROI, we talk about, you know, profitability and so on from the study from ThinkBox. So if it's an investment, you get the ROI, or you don't if you have a bad run. So no, cost is cost. There's money leaving the business and with no return to be expected. So I can't agree with our friend from Nationwide.
Yeah. Well, that's some really interesting stuff there. And, you know, if Heineken's dumb phone, boring phone catches on, that may mean that we'll have to stop doing marketing tech and apps, because people won't be developing apps anymore, will they? Never mind. Let's move on for a deep dive. This is also one of my favorite parts of the show. So, Pascal, let's move on to content spotlights. In this part of the show, Pascal and I bring to the table an item of content that's caught our attention over the past few weeks. Could be a podcast, could be an article, could be a video. So, Pascal, please tell me, what have you got for us this week?
This is a return of an article from the Think with Google platform, and it was emailed to me. And listen, I don't have time to read everything, but that title was just too compelling. So here it is. Premier Performance, how Odeon revamped its search strategy with a new era of marketing. And in fact, within the email kind of preview version, the term artificial intelligence was there as well. So I think, hang on a minute, we're talking about strategies, we're talking about movies and cinemas, and we're talking about AI. I've got to look into this. So this article was actually written and submitted by Pippa Ward, who's the senior marketing manager at the UK and Ireland Odeon Cinemas Group, one of the best job ever in marketing and working for the world of cinema. And whilst at first one could be dismissal as being some kind of advertorial, because it is, you know, by extension promoting the Google search ads platform and the new AI platform, as I was reading, I was thinking, now this is better than that. And actually I was thinking of you. You're going to really enjoy some of the insights from Pippa. So it all begins with a bit of history. I didn't know that the Odeon started in Birmingham in the 1930s. And they've always been very loyal to this idea of creating an experience. But what this article is really exploring is changing in behavior, changing in the way in which people find out about movies. So Pippa kind of talks about a time where you and I would have gone to the movies and we would just go there and just look what was available. And it was a bit more spontaneous back in the days, if you recall, and you would treat yourself. And sometimes you would arrive at the time where you had to wait quite a bit, you know, half an hour before you could go into seeing your movie. There was a time where people spent a lot of time in the office talking about the movies, you know, and they would have that kind of water cooler conversation. People do it a bit more via internet, like the podcast and this show. But we're saying now things have changed. People spend less time in the office, so there's less chance for conversation. There is actually a vast reduction. I wasn't aware of that necessarily. A vast reduction in the distributors and the makers themselves in the marketing spend, so that Odeon has to pick up, you know, the gap. But also, frankly, everyone's moved on to pre-booking online. You know, more than half of the bookings for the Odeon now is done online. So there's a big change in behavior has been analyzed. Now, historically, excuse me, what Odeon would have done is identify that search. It was an important channel for them, and off they went, obviously using optimization for organic traffic, if you will, and using advertising. And they identified that movies near me is actually quite an important sentence. So they organize all the advertising around location, ticket type, keyword grouping, you know, all the kind of skill and understanding you need for advertising. But this was done around 100 120 cinemas across the UK, Roger. Can you imagine? So that led to hundreds of different ad groups, and we ended up with some element of complexity. So the first step, actually, before you even talk about using AI, was for the humans to take over and reduce complexity. And I thought, oh, that's something Roger's going to really enjoy listening to. Then they looked at behavior. And they said, whilst we understand that there are people looking for the special offers or the days where the price are a bit lower, we are seeing, according to paper, a growing demand for luxury experiences. We're back to that. IMAX, the Lux IMAX, which we have in Durham, not far from here, and other options like better food and drink services and so on. So what they did actually, instead of casting this massive net all over the interweb, they actually reduced it to those kind of experience seekers and really targeted them more, more precisely. And then they used the Google AI-powered smart bidding and more. And then the rest of the article will tell you a bit more about it. Now, she can look back and will tell us that the conversion rate jumped by 43%, but also the overall cost per click was reduced by 46%. And that saving is then reinvesting into the search and audience profiling. So what she has concluded is that, it's remarkable what simplicity can do and can create for you in terms of result. And her kind of closing statement is as follows. When technology and customer behaviors are rapidly shifting, you simply cannot rely on outdated strategies and structures, even if they have served you well in the past.
Yeah, this is really interesting, isn't it? I love it. I mean, I love the simplicity angle, and you knew that I would love the simplicity angle, but it is absolutely spot on. I think everybody, us included, need to sit back from time to time just to check that we aren't allowing complexity to seep in, because it creeps up on you. You almost let it happen. It's like the age old, you put the frog in the cold water and slowly heat the water up, and the frog doesn't notice until it boils to death. It's a bit like that complexity, isn't it? It just gets in there, and they've looked at it, and they've obviously cleared out a lot of the complexity, and it's worked for them. I think it was also interesting that you don't hear search as much as we used to. I mean, obviously, a lot of people say, oh, well, search is dead now that we've got AI because, Google, we won't need Google anymore because we'll just be getting answers to questions. But here's an example where they've used that simple approach to use search to a massive advantage for them, and it's been reflected in the results.
No, absolutely, and that's what I like. So, like I say, at first you could really kind of put it to one side and say, well, it's just going to be some kind of mock article to really plug the Google solution. But actually, the whole story, from reflecting on what used to be as behavior, the new behavior, what we need as a marketing and sales division, and then what can AI do for us? I think it's exactly the process you have to go through, as opposed to adopting an AI solution and looking for the problem they can solve for you, which currently people do a hell of a lot. Now, during the intro to the show, you gave us, the wonderful news that we have the return of Mark Ritson. So I just can't wait. What have you selected for us today?
Of course, Mark Ritson is a columnist for Marketing Week. I have featured his work on the show numerous times, and usually, Pascal, I have to admit, it's one of his rants that catches my eye, and that is usually why I select the article. Now, I have to admit, in this particular occasion, it wasn't particularly the rant, and in fact, as articles go by Mark Ritson, this is perhaps one of the least ranty that I've ever seen. I don't even think he actually swears in this article either, which is quite unusual for Mark Ritson. But I just thought it was a fascinating topic. And the heading of the article is this applicable to B2B marketing? Question mark. And then please stop asking. And he starts off semi-humorous, saying that he's done hundreds of marketing talks all over the world, and pretty much every single talk he ever gives, wherever he gives it, when he talks about whatever the subject is, marketing strategy, whether it's positioning, whether it's the 4Ps, somebody will always put their hands up and say, is this also relevant for B2B marketing? Now, he always gets really annoyed at this because his view is that marketing is marketing, and the principles apply whether your customer is B2C or B2B, but he also thinks that there is this world where some people think that B2C marketing and B2B marketing is a completely different concept, and you cannot transfer ideas across between the two. And so he always gets this question asked when he does presentations: is this relevant to B2B marketing? And his answer always is yes, of course it is. And what the article then does is try to deconstruct why we have this potential issue where we have people who work in B2B thinking that it's a completely different process than people working in B2C. And he starts thinking, well, is it me? Is it me? Because when I do my presentations, he says, I probably do end up using quite a lot of B2C examples in my presentations. And he says, well, actually, when I think about it, that might be part of the problem. But, he says, I've worked 50% of my career in B2B. And he said, he could happily use an example of selling a dialysis machine to hospitals, for example. But he says, in my presentation, I'd first need to have to explain what dialysis is and what ESKD means and what HD and PD modalities do and what hospital buying committees do and what private clinics and public hospitals and tender structures and market access and health insurance and providers and payers and policy makers do. And then he says about 4.5 hours later, I'd be able to make the marketing point, or alternative, I can show you a picture of a pint of Guinness and get onto the marketing stuff 4 seconds later. So what he's saying is that a lot of the time, B2C marketing, the stories that you can tell are instantly recognizable to everybody, because you are going to be talking about something like an individual buying a pint of Guinness or an individual buying a flight with Ryanair. Whereas B2B, there is always going to be a little bit more complexity in that there's probably a buying team, a procurement department. But what he then goes on to say in the article is that beyond that, the principles of marketing are exactly the same. You've got to identify a group of customers, work out what that group of customers' need is, create a product or a service that meets that need, better and preferably different to everybody else, and then come up with some sort of promotional strategy, whether it's advertising, content, whatever, to make that group of people aware of the product or service. And the same process applies from B2C as it does from B2B. But we've got this mindset that it's a completely different process. And really, just to highlight the point that actually it shouldn't be different, is that if you look even at B2C, the person who buys the pint of Guinness is likely to be different to the person who buys the flight with Ryanair, or different to the person who buys a car. Each marketing problem or each marketing project that you and I take on as marketing consultants or as marketers has a unique set of variables that we need to look at. We need to work out the customer. We need to do all of that analysis. And then the answer, whether it's B2C or whether it's B2B, will be different. So what he's saying is you can have differences within B2C just in the same way as you have differences within B2B. But the marketing principles across the piece are the same. And what we should be doing is, rather than trying to tag it as B2C or B2B, is we just say, this is today's marketing challenge, and this is the best way of meeting the needs of the customer in that group, whether it's an individual customer or whether it's the buying committee in a kidney dialysis hospital. So there you go, a sensible article with very little swearing from Mr. Mark Ritson.
It's brilliant, because, I mean, you and I've faced this all the time. And in my line of work, where I would facilitate workshop or speak at events, this is what I get back. You've got the envy of those who are in the B2C world thinking, well, it's easier for them lot in B2B. And vice versa, you've got B2B saying, well, that's not fair because you can't be as creative as the B2C marketers. And it's all nonsense. And I think, what you should do is, of course, look at all sectors and all variables, as you mentioned, and pick out the lessons. But I would agree with what he said, though. I mean, and it may help me as well, because I've been very critical, as you recall throughout the show, about the very poor example given by the brands. It could be Facebook at that conference, it could be Google, where all they talk about is buying food or getting a haircut or getting a pair of shoes, doing the demonstration of their improved platform. I'm thinking, well, there's more to life, and actually there's more to business life than just those consumer products. But I can see now that it makes it easier to put a point across about the features and benefits of a platform. But certainly for me, if I try and introduce B2B example, I suppose the kind of compromise is talk about professional services. So you say, if you're an accountant and if you are an architect, or if you're that, people can relate to those purchases in a kind of business life. But I would agree, I don't have, up my sleeve, complex B2B products and services, because rightly so, you want to avoid having to describe the sector or describe the buying behavior to get on with making your point about marketing. But this B2C, B2B is another one, isn't it? Because you wouldn't hear an accountant say to you, "I'm sorry, I can't help you. I only help people in that sector." I mean, they may have chosen from a business strategy point of view to specialize, but rarely would you have someone working in HR turn you down because somehow you don't fit that box. So yeah, great article and great reflection from Mark Ritson.
So, Pascal, it's time for This Week in History, which means we've got to fire up the flux capacitor. We have got to set the controls of the TARDIS. We have got to find 2.21 gigawatts of energy to head back in time for This Week in History.
In 1937, while landing at Lakehurst, New Jersey, on its first transatlantic crossing of the year, the German dirigible Hindenburg burst into flames and was destroyed, killing 36 of the 97 persons on board.
In 1958, classic Hammer horror film Dracula, starring Christopher Lee as the eponymous vampire alongside Peter Cushing, directed by Terence Fisher, was released.
That scared me so much. In 1963, the US launched the Telstar 2 communication satellite on behalf of its private owner, AT&T. This superseded the AT&T original Telstar satellite, who had ceased operating in 1962 due to damage caused by radiation.
In 1980, the first film in the Friday the 13th franchise is released. A story about a group of young camp counselors who are murdered by an unknown slasher introduced the infamous character of Jason Voorhees. My goodness, I can't believe that's nearly 44 years old, that film. That's incredible.
Crazy. There's been so many since then, and people are still confused. In the very first one, it's the mother who is the killer, not Jason.
Yes.
With a very young Kevin Bacon, if memory serves.
Absolutely right. So, Pascal, I wanted to talk to you about the Hindenburg. Now, what an incredible machine this was, and obviously it was a really sad disaster that happened, and the fact that it was caught on news film as well as it was coming into land. They were actually filming the arrival, and of course it burst into flames, and literally within 30 seconds to a minute, no longer, the entire framework of this dirigible, this airship, just collapsed into the ground. And obviously, as you've said, sadly so many people were killed. I remember seeing a film that they made out of the Hindenburg. I don't think it was a particularly good film, but they sort of used some of that real footage in the film to make it feel more authentic. But what I've always thought about that is that was definitely a turning point, wasn't it? Because had the Hindenburg worked, it could have changed the way aviation developed. And we could have gone down completely different path, because the Hindenburg was an airship, wasn't it? It was a bit like the Titanic, but it flew and it was luxurious, and you had to pay a lot of money to fly on it, and you were fed sumptuous food and drink, and everybody dressed up for dinner, and it had cabins and all of that sort of thing. Whereas the airliners that we ended up with, you could argue, are completely the opposite. Unless you're lucky enough to be able to afford first class travel, you're going to be stuffed into a rather uncomfortable economy seat. But had the Hindenburg not blown up and hadn't caused all those deaths. I just wonder whether we'd now be flying around in airships rather than aeroplanes. What do you think?
Yeah, and certainly there would have been the options. And other historians also talk about whether World War II would have been a bit different,
Mhm.
with the addition of the dirigibles to maybe sadly drop bombs all over Europe and so on. So I would agree, turning point in terms of thinking back about the technology and aeronautics. But at the time, if you put that to one side, what an incredible endeavor and the engineering that went into it to make it obviously a dirigible. You could control this and not be at the whim of winds as you would maybe with a hot air balloon.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, they were slow, weren't they? Let's face it. I think it took as long to go over the Atlantic in an airship as it did in a boat, or maybe slightly faster, but it was still quite slow compared to, the
Mm.
7 or 8 hours it would take to go over in a 777, a Boeing 777. But very interesting nonetheless. So, tell me about Telstar,
Yeah,
Pascal.
so let's go from the sky then to space. So what is interesting, and it is Telstar. I keep getting it wrong as saying Tesla. They're not the same thing at all. And I think it's obviously a portmanteau to tel for telephony, maybe, or television, and star. So this is number two. And what was interesting, and the reason I wanted to mention it is how thankful we can be that people don't give up at the first hurdle or the first failure. So as I read, there was a number one, and it ceased operating almost within months of being launched by AT&T and others because of radiation that perhaps wasn't either thought of or had not been understood as well. So if they go off, they go again, spending all that money for a number two and number three, because number two only lasted 2 years, and
Yeah.
eventually just because of normal wear and tear. But the number one, I wonder that if that was really the reason why they didn't give up, was a success. I mean, when it was first launched in 62, it was able to relay, its first non-public pictures. And actually, it was a combination between the UK and France. So the UK had the big satellite dish that you sometimes see as well in documentaries in Cornwall. In France was in Brittany. And they were able to broadcast essentially a program from Europe and from the US. For the first time, people can actually see something from another country and, across the waters. There's a bit of a fun story where ideally what they wanted and what they were hoping for is for the first broadcast to feature President John F. Kennedy. But actually, the signal got acquired too early. The guy wasn't available, actually. So in a panic, they had to quickly find something to show people, which was essentially, at the time, a sports game, because people used to watch TV a lot for sports. But when eventually they managed to do the broadcast properly, they had a program from CBS, they had a program from NBC, and the BBC managed to do a broadcast with Richard Dimbleby. Which leads me to my question: is Richard Dimbleby immortal? Because this time we talk about things to do with telephony, television, broadcasting, and so on from the past. His name is mentioned all of the time.
It's absolutely right when you come to think of it. He's there, isn't he? He's one of these. Maybe he's a time traveler. Maybe he has got a TARDIS, or he has got the DeLorean, and he just keeps flitting about and appearing at certain times, just so that we always think that he's there.
It's like Richard Attenborough, maybe it's just
Absolutely.
we will them to last forever,
Oh my goodness. So, Pascal, let's bring ourselves right back to the present, but never ever let us forget the debt that we owe these pioneers from the past who have given us the world that we live in today. Time to move on now to marketing, tech, and apps. Okay, Pascal, what are you bringing to the table today?
I've got some updates for you and our viewers and listeners from some of our favorite platforms. I can't be sure whether the first one is everyone's favorite, but I'm going to talk about Zoom. So Zoom, about a week or so ago, had a new webinar that they're going to do on a monthly basis to give us users more regular updates on the different products that they do, which I think is going to be great. But the big announcement was something that was very discreet, actually. It was only released in March as a press release stroke blog article, is the upgrade for all paying accounts from Zoom to Zoom Workplace. So that's a new name for the Zoom platform. Now, you have to download the new kind of app, if you will, on your desktop to really have the full version. I was very, very confused. I thought it would happen automatically. I was looking for the new features and the new things you could do during the demonstration, and I got mightily confused. But there was a live chat and all was cleared. So the Zoom Workplace gives you actually a much neater interface, that kind of on occasion clunky menu or very, very busy menu for some people who are not used to Zoom is a bit more elegant. But for me, the big change, and something that's been long overdue, is that you can now customize the wallpaper. So if anyone understand how Zoom works, you've got your little windows, and then all of us are kind of surrounded by this black, dark environment. And now you can customize that and add colors that have been pre-uploaded. So as I'm talking to you, and as we're using Zoom to record this episode, you are in this kind of nice green background now with some kind of different hues, which is a bit more kinder to the eye. But hopefully you can upload your own images. So, people can then start to put some bright colors, they can even put their logos. If you're using, like Roger and I, the service of an editor, you could actually put the background as the green screen. It would facilitate, the editing and so on. So there's a few more things. The chat is a lot better. The history around sharing information now, you can go back weeks and months and find the document that you share during maybe a coaching session. They're promising the AI also companion will be even better at transcription and summarizing. So Zoom Workplace, it's an update. You could say it's an upgrade, and you have to download the app. The second one announcement for me is from our good friend at Captivate.fm, the hosting platform that we use for the audio version of this magazine. And what they've done is launched a YouTube embed as part of the Captivate site, but more importantly for me, as part of the Captivate podcast player. So in future, as long as you've kind of copied and pasted the YouTube URL as part of the the form that you fill in to put all the details for the podcast, then when you embed the player on your website and more, there will be the option to listen but also to watch at the same time. And I know it's a small update, Roger, but that's going to make life so much easier, because you and I on occasion will have to copy and paste the embed for the podcast from Captivate and do the embed from YouTube. Now it's just one thing, and I'm hoping that means that platforms like Spotify and many others allow, therefore, the audio and the video to appear at the same time. And I've got the third one very quickly. It was mentioned last week in the news section. Don't forget, everyone, in your Google business profile, you can now tick the box to have your social media updates appearing as part of your entry on Google Maps.
Fantastic. I did wonder why my Zoom hadn't turned into this new fangled version, but of course you've just answered that. So I've got to completely download something different. So do I delete the old version, or does downloading the new version?
I didn't. So we've got the hyperlink, everyone, for the download page. They're using a PC or a Mac and so on. But really, I just downloaded. I should check really if I've got now two versions. One that is defunct, shall we say, and then the Zoom Workplace has taken over.
All right. Okay. So my updates this week for marketing tech and apps, just simply because we're heading towards summer. We've already talked about traveling a little bit. And as always, around this time of year, I start thinking about holidays, perhaps. I've got a couple of business trips coming up as well. So I just started having a look at travel apps again. And, from time to time, certain apps seem to acquire more prominence than others. And for a long time, when it came to things like hotels, you were probably going to use either hotels.com or booking.com. But there's it's not a new app, but there's an app which I haven't used much before, which I have been using more recently. It's called Skyscanner. Now, predominantly, Skyscanner is actually a cheap flights app or website. And actually, if you're going multiple cities, so if I wanted to say go to somewhere in Eastern Europe and had to fly say from Edinburgh to Vienna to Belgrade or something like that. Skyscanner is remarkably good at linking up flights for the cheapest prices, but also, and most importantly, to make sure that the stopovers at the airport in the middle aren't long, because sometimes you can end up sitting in an airport for 6 hours halfway through your trip, whereas what Skyscanner does is it tries to minimize that time. But what I've been most impressed by with Skyscanner has been the hotel deals that it has unearthed. Now, I'm usually in the camp that you can get the best hotel deals by going direct to the hotel's own website, but there have been a few examples recently where I've been able to find better deals on Skyscanner for those hotels. Now, admittedly, if you sign up, you do start to build up their sort of version of loyalty points, and maybe that has something to do with it. But worth checking out if you're an avid user of booking.com or hotels.com. Just give Skyscanner a try. You might be pleasantly surprised. And the second one caught my attention just because I had to read it a couple of times to check whether it was actually real and it wasn't a joke, because I'm not really quite sure that I would want to do this. But this new app is called 𝗬𝗓𝗄𝗃, and I can only describe it as a sort of Airbnb light. But basically what it is it allows people to sell their couches, i.e. their sofa or their settee, if you want to call it that, in their house, to let people stay the night and make money from it. So rather than renting out a room in your house like you do with Airbnb, 𝗬𝗓𝗄𝗃 allows you to hire out your couch or hire out your sofa. And therefore, you could have some random person just turning up at your house at 10 to 10 one night and asking, I've booked your sofa for the night, mate. Okay, it's in there. And they crash out on your sofa whilst you're finishing watching the latest episode of Death in Paradise. So I just found that was a little bit bizarre, but I guess it probably appeals to Gen Z or Gen Z who aren't wanting to spend lots of money on hotels or even lots of money on Airbnb. And I have read quite a lot of articles recently. Airbnb is getting very, very expensive now with all the extra charges that are included. So maybe 𝗬𝗓𝗄𝗃 is the new way of doing things on the cheap for Gen Z people who are wanting to travel around the world.
But what I like about those is back to this idea of demographics. It's about this idea of research. I'm sure they didn't go ahead, on a whim. And yeah, I mean, music festivals would be perfect for that, and more. I mean, because Airbnb, I would agree, it's getting almost to the point where it feels like a tactic to remove a number of users. And I know that there's been all sort of things happening. Yeah, great. And what is interesting about your discovery is whilst from the marketing point of view you can go, well, I don't have a need for what either Roger or Pascal are talking about. You can still investigate the user experience. You can still investigate the branding. You can still investigate their communication activities as a source of inspiration, which is really at the heart of this audio and video magazine.
Yeah, absolutely. Always good to have a look at the marketing apps and the technology that we are using in our business lives. But Pascal, we have finally reached what is always one of the highlights of the show. It is time for film marketing. Oh, it's making me cold just thinking about this film, Pascal. We are going to be looking at the disaster movie, The Day After Tomorrow, first released in 2004. Let's watch the trailer.
Are at a loss to explain what is causing this weather and why it has taken them by surprise.
That sudden drop in temperature as half an hour ago. Mexican officials closed the border in the light of so many U.S. refugees.
We prepare to go live to Los Angeles.
Are you getting this on camera? What you see is happening now.
Look over there behind me! That's a tornado! Yes! A twister!
This is just
massive.
And lower Manhattan is virtually inaccessible.
A wall of water coming towards New York City. Everybody, get out!
Save as many as you can.
Yeah, I'm definitely feeling cold after watching that trailer, Pascal. It's so white.
You know, that's at the heart of the marketing campaign, because of course a movie is very visual, and you've got the lean on the posters and the lobby cards. They were still around 2004 and so on. But this idea of, we can all relate. We've all had that time where it was so cold. We were a little unnerved by it, But if we begin with looking back, so I remember vividly going to the cinema to go and see this, because again, the trailer worked for me, and probably some of the reviews in the magazines back then, and the posters in the cinema. But to me, for all this movie was derided a lot by the scientific community and others, this was a fun ride, and what I call a real popcorn movie, where you felt very well looked after as an audience. But I also was thinking, why do we like disaster movies so much?
It did make me, it was a bit of a joke about feeling cold and all of this sort of thing, but maybe that was one of the reasons it stood out, because it was about the disaster of the cold and the snow and the disaster coming from that. Because if you think about it, the majority of disaster movies involve heat of some form or other, don't they? I'm sure there was a film one point called The Day the Earth Caught Fire. The Towering Inferno is about fire. Films like Independence Day, also directed by Roland Emmerich, are predominantly featuring explosions with fire, whereas this is all about cold. And I think that's one of the reasons for me why it was just so different and stunning to look at on the screen. Because of that, it was such a different. And because we can relate to that landscape, we all like to wake up of a morning and see the snow, and maybe the fairy tale effect wears off a bit when you have to start digging your car out the driveway. But you always get that moment when you think, oh, that is so pretty. But what we got here was that prettiness suddenly became terrifying, and that was the thing that really struck it for me.
Yeah, and the trailer does a very good job as well to showcase, the CGI and disaster sequences. And actually, I watched the movie again a couple of weeks ago. 20 years on, those special effects still stand up. It's not like sometimes you have to forgive the movie, if you will, and almost being taken out of it. But it's not just that. I think the characters are really likable. It's also taking place in so different parts of the world. You've got the UK, you've got the US, you've got all that going on. It moves on very fast. It's not a slow movie at all. Maybe sometimes it is a bit fast. And you mentioned obviously the director, Roland Emmerich, and I know that in the industry, people will sometimes have a bit of a wry smile, thinking, "Oh yeah, here he goes again, destroying something." He's been kind of nicknamed by some, I'm told, the master of disaster. Talking about the phonetics there. But if you look at his filmography, the one that I've worked on, Universal Soldier, 1992, with 80s, 90s action heroes, Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren. Stargate was superb in 94. Oh my goodness. So that's also an anniversary this year for Stargate as well. You had Independence Day, the sequel, Godzilla, I went to see, and The Day After Tomorrow. And to me, it feels more like Roland, essentially. He's just a big fan of the 90s, 50s, and 60s sci-fi movies, and he's almost exploring the different genres, from alien invasion to, different worlds, to the kind of superhumans and cyborgs, and all the way to, the Earth just turning on us. We know that this is based on the book called The Coming Global Superstorm. And then, we've had the visual stimuli. But I'm a huge fan, and I don't necessarily agree with people saying, "Oh, it's silly," or "It's nonsense." I mean, most movies, particularly fiction work, is meant to be nonsense, but make you think about it. But yeah, going back to the trailer, though, what did you think of the trailer? I mean, it's a 20-year-old trailer, but I don't think we would do things much differently nowadays. In fact,
no, and it is the fact that, as you say, that there's only what is it? Did you say 7 spoken words in the trailer? Save as many as you can, which is spoken by in home Dr. Terry Raps, and there is an animated text. But I suppose we're used to trailers from this era of having the voiceover, and again, maybe that's one of the reasons why this stood out, was that they didn't, and that they used text and the visuals to convey the epic nature of the film that we were going to be seeing.
Yeah, and the animated text, I mean, I like it because actually when you look at it, 10,000 years ago, one storm changed the face of our planet. On May 28th, it will happen again, which was the official launch of the movie. Where will you be? ? Which became the tagline and almost the kind of leitmotif for the entire campaign. And then it closes from the director of Independence Day. And you don't see that done as often now, kind of mentioning that the driving force behind this movie is someone that you can trust because you've enjoyed a previous product, a previous movie, in this case, Independence Day. So no, that's great. So yeah, I just mentioned actually the date of the official release. Want to take us through the premieres, actually?
Yeah, I mean, it was the world premiere was in Mexico City on May the 17th, 2004. And of course, you think, well, what a weird place to have the world premiere. But of course, it's in the movie, isn't it? And then it was released in theaters in the US, May 28th, Memorial Day weekend. And of course, what do you do on Memorial Day weekend? You get your family up and you take them to the movies. So it was a great family film for Memorial Day in 2004.
And, that's what marketing is all about. You make wise decisions based on behavior. Why wouldn't you maximize the sales? I mean, this was, one of the most successful movie 2004 as revenue wise. I do think that the premiere in Mexico was brave because you don't understand why until you've seen the film. So, but I like it because most premieres, they almost kind of the, accepted de facto PR stunt. And I don't know about you, but I don't think they have the same sense of excitement. I mean, it's always good for you and I to see, in the news what's happening in London at the, at the Odeon and that kind of things. But so to me, choosing Mexico was in itself a bit of a PR hook because people would say, well, why not Los Angeles? How dare you? So, I quite like the idea of maybe the press, kind of reacting to that. Now, 2004, we are 10 years, give or take, after the birth of the internet as publicly launched. So it must have been quite exciting back then to launch a website. Now, sadly, as you and I've reported time and time again, the website is no longer available. Although I have to say, since obviously this was distributed by 20th Century Fox, now owned by Disney, there's something quite clever in the kind of infamous 404 error, page. So it's not just a blank; it doesn't exist. You have an animation with Wreck-It Ralph, if I'm not mistaken, kind of looking confused, saying, "Well, that's not right. Where should it be?" Sadly, if you try and persist, it doesn't take you to the Day After Tomorrow landing page within the Disney Plus kind of ecosystem, just take you to the normal homepage. But thanks to the Wayback Machine, we've been able to, kind of find just the homepage from back in 2004. So we have some indication of this interesting countdown, Roger, where they were showing the disaster scene of New York, in Under the Ice, but in reverse order. So we're counting backwards to the 28th of May. So in January 2004, you had just this homepage with New York skyscape completely covered in ice, quite a bit. And it's almost like the new ice age. And if you look very, very carefully, if you took the time, you could see 2 little figures kind of walking towards it in this kind of icy expanse. and then you could choose a language and go into the deeper side of the website. Sadly, Wayback Machine couldn't help me much more than that. In April, in reverse order, we saw New York, not as much snow, not as much white, and very striking, you had a cargo ship just stuck against, the side of New York in the ice. So the question is, how did it get there? And then as you move backward in time and you're into the May kind of launch campaign, then you had this almighty tsunami wave, which is just absolutely staggering to watch in the movie. And you kind of go, right, this is how it all began, the tsunami wave, then the incredible cold snap, coming from space. So there was a website. Now, happily, thanks to movie marketing historian Chris Thilk, we're able to know a bit more. So he wrote an article 20 years ago, actually, for a website called Film Threat, Roger. And we knew that, well, no surprise there. The website was primarily in Flash. These were the days of website, and you had a countdown to the launch. Wasn't always working, but that's Flash for you. And the site had around 5 main sections, production notes, multimedia with montage and so on. But again, things that nowadays feel a little, well, of course you would, but 20 years ago, these were the beginning of using the web to promote movies. You had also a section called City Freeze. You could pick 8 major cities, including London and Paris, and watch an animation of your city literally being covered by snowfall, which they did use, as you'll tell us in a moment, in some of the posters. They had a Weather Gone Wild section using some of the science behind the movie, and then something that I wasn't fully able to understand, but this Out of Time, where you can register your name and being given a shout out on the website. Now, again, you and I don't have access to it anymore. I keep pleading with all those distributors, give it to Roger and I. We look after those websites for you, because I think it's an important part of film marketing history. But on reflection, in the article that Chris wrote, he was saying that it seemed as though the designers couldn't decide whether this should be a serious website using scientific kind of data as the backdrop, or should it be tongue-in-cheek. And because they couldn't quite make up their mind, it left the website feeling a little, it didn't hook people as much as it could have at the time.
And the posters followed pretty similar, or the main poster followed a similar sort of 3-stage event. So we've got a picture of the Statue of Liberty, the torch of the Statue of Liberty being swamped by a wave. Then you've got the Statue of Liberty frozen in a snowscape, and then you've got that close-up of New York with the 2 figures walking across the snow. Quite simple posters, very striking. Maybe it's giving a bit too much away about the plot, I don't know. Do you know what really struck me when I saw that? Is it just reminded me of the end of the original of Planet of the Apes, when Charlton Heston is wandering along the beach and he sees the Statue of Liberty wrecked and sort of on its side in the sand, and he suddenly realizes that this is actually Earth that he's come to, and that this is what the future of Earth looks like. That I was getting vibes from that. But of course, there was localized versions of the posters as well. There's one with the Eiffel Tower in it, for example. So, but very, very simple, playing on that very, very deep, thick snow and the cold. And again, I think it stands out because of that.
But you mentioned the Planet of the Apes, then, almost fuels the argument about Roland being this big fan of the 50s and 60s, sci-fi movies. I mean, I don't remember when Planet of the Apes came out, but I'm going to say it's the 50s movies, perhaps a fraction later. But that final scene, yes, I mean, as a child, I remember being sat with my dad thinking, what? Just don't expect it. Now, what is interesting, I was mentioning to you about the website, and making reference to scientific facts. And I think what the movie did do is to stimulate conversations about the impact of human and the way in which we will pollute, the Earth and its impact on climate change and so on 20 years ago. So you had a bit of all sorts. You had people, for example, from the National Geographic News saying, yep, let's talk about this. Day After Tomorrow movie, could ice age occur overnight, and discuss it and whatever. So you had some serious publication, but you had quite some serious backlash. So the NASA scientists were approached actually to help with the movie. And when they looked at what it was and maybe the script or the treatment, they felt they were so ridiculous that they actually denied, and they even sent a memo allegedly around the office saying, to anyone working for NASA, do not provide any comments or any feedback to this movie. But I'm told that they kind of realized it was maybe a bit strong. It's just a movie after all. It's just there to stimulate things. But suddenly, the movie was then shown not just in cinemas, but also used by environmental groups to once again stimulate the debate about awareness raising. So on one hand, you've got NASA saying, no, this is a stupid movie, we're not going to intervene, which encourages people to go and see it, as a result of which, more people have a conversation about it. So for me, this is what's fascinating about PR, because you're naysayers and you're advocates, but if you have a good product and if you are determined to provide primarily entertainment through very good acting, we mentioned, you and I, the CGI is stunning. I mean, really for the time, it's incredible. But actually, you get to really care for Dennis Quaid, for Jake Gyllenhaal, and all the others, and you feel as cold as they appear, on screen.
Well, they do say that there's no such thing as bad publicity, no such thing as bad PR, even when it is. And of course, just to finish off this section of film marketing, I think we know that this film featured so many visual effects. I think you found out there were 416 visual effects shots from 9 different effects houses, most notably Industrial Light and Magic and Digital Domain, but over 1,000 people working on this film for a year. But what's really interesting is you put out a tweet yesterday, I think, didn't you?
I did.
To say, we are going to be reviewing this film, and something remarkable happened, didn't it, Pascal?
Well, yeah, so I said, listen, Roger and I are going to be recording episode 117. We're going to talk about this film, published 20 years ago. Anyone remember seeing it? And by the way, we'd love to hear from 20th Century Fox and Roland Emmerich. And the tweet was liked by the man himself. So I got a like from Roland Emmerich late last night.
Fantastic. So hopefully he will listen to the show when we get it out there. So this is it is nice. We don't expect everybody to reply. We don't expect everybody to like things, but when we copy people in to our articles and our spotlights and our film marketing reviews, it's just really, it just makes us feel warm inside, especially after we've talked about such a cold film. It makes us feel warm inside to get a little bit of a thumbs up from the people that we're talking about. Well, Pascal, episode 117, an absolute pleasure once again to spend time with you talking about our favourite subjects, marketing and films. And everyone out there, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about in the future. If there's any marketing tech and apps out there you think we should have a look at, tell us. If you think there's a piece of content that you want us to do a deep dive on, tell us. Give us a comment on the YouTube channel or look for us on Twitter or X or whatever Elon Musk is calling it these days. Thank you so much for watching the show. Until the next time, go out there and make sure that your marketing is done right. I was Roger Edwards and he was Pascal Fintoni.